Welcome to Sarge's Briefings. Today we're going to talk about a subject that every CDL driver needs to understand, whether you think it'll ever affect you or not. DOT, drug and alcohol testing, violations, and the SAP program. There's a lot of confusion out there about what actually happens when a driver has a positive test, refuses a test, or commits another DOT drug or alcohol violation. I've heard drivers say that a failed test means your CDL is gone forever. I've heard others say that once you complete the SAP program, every trucking company has to give you another chance. Neither one of those statements tells the whole story. So in this briefing, we're going to walk through what can count as a DOT violation, what happens immediately afterward, what a substance abuse professional actually does, how the return to duty process works, and something that's extremely important for drivers to understand. Becoming eligible to return to safety-sensitive work does not necessarily mean a trucking company is required to hire you. We're going to keep this straightforward and easy to understand. And remember, this video is provided for general informational purposes only. It is not legal or professional advice. Regulations and individual circumstances can change, so if you're dealing with a specific situation, always verify the current requirements and speak with the appropriate qualified professional. All right. Let's start with the first question. What actually counts as a DOT drug or alcohol violation? Now let's talk about what actually counts as a DOT drug or alcohol violation. The most obvious is a positive drug or alcohol test, but that's not the only way a driver can find themselves with a violation. Refusing to take a required DOT test can also be considered a violation, and refusal doesn't always mean simply saying, "I'm not taking the test." Certain actions, such as failing to appear for a required test, leaving the testing process before it's completed, or attempting to tamper with or interfere with the testing process, may also be treated as a refusal under DOT regulations. That's why it's important for drivers to understand that when you're directed to complete a DOT required test, you need to follow the testing procedure from beginning to end. If you're ever unsure about what's being required of you during the testing process, ask questions and make sure you understand your responsibilities before making a decision that could affect your ability to perform safety-sensitive work. The bottom line is this: a DOT violation isn't limited to simply testing positive. A refusal or failure to properly complete a required test can carry serious consequences as well. So what happens once a driver actually has a DOT violation? That's what we'll cover next. Once a DOT drug or alcohol violation occurs, the consequences are immediate. The driver must be removed from DOT safety-sensitive duties. For a CDL driver, that means you cannot legally operate a commercial motor vehicle in a safety-sensitive capacity until you've completed the required return to duty process. The violation is also reported to the FMCSA Drug and Alcohol Clearinghouse, creating a record that employers are required to check as part of the federal clearinghouse requirements. At this point, you don't simply wait a few days, take another test, and go back to driving. There is a specific process that must be followed. The driver must begin the return to duty process, which starts with an evaluation by a qualified substance abuse professional, commonly referred to as a SAP. It's important to understand that being removed from safety-sensitive duties doesn't necessarily mean your CDL itself disappears, but you are prohibited from performing DOT safety-sensitive functions until the federal return to duty requirements have been satisfied. And here's something else drivers need to understand. Completing this process and becoming eligible to perform safety-sensitive work again does not guarantee that your current employer will keep you or that another trucking company will hire you. We'll talk more about that later in this briefing. But first, let's answer an important question. What exactly is a SAP and what do they do? Now let's talk about the person who plays a central role in the return to duty process, the SAP, or substance abuse professional. A SAP is a qualified professional who evaluates individuals who have violated DOT drug and alcohol regulations and makes recommendations concerning the education, treatment, follow-up testing, and other steps that may be required before the return to duty process can move forward. One important thing to understand is that the SAP is an independent evaluator. They don't work for the FMCSA, and they aren't there to represent your employer or a future trucking company. Their responsibility is to evaluate your individual situation and determine what steps you need to complete under the return to duty process. And this isn't a process where the driver gets to pick and choose which recommendations they want to follow. Once the SAP establishes the required course of action, those requirements must be successfully completed before the SAP can determine that you're eligible to move forward to the next step. Every driver's situation can be different. One person may be required to complete an education program, while another may have additional treatment or counseling recommendations. The important thing to remember is that the SAP is the professional responsible for evaluating the driver and establishing the requirements that must be completed before the return to duty process can continue. So, what kinds of requirements might a SAP recommend? Let's take a look at that next. Once a driver has been evaluated by a substance abuse professional, the SAP will determine what requirements must be completed before the driver can move forward in the return to duty process. Those requirements are based on the individual evaluation, so they may not be exactly the same for every driver. Depending on the circumstances, the SAP may recommend an education program, treatment, counseling, or a combination of different requirements. The important thing to understand is that simply scheduling an appointment with a SAP doesn't complete the process. The driver must follow the recommendations and successfully complete the requirements established by the SAP. Once those requirements have been completed, the driver returns to the SAP for a follow-up evaluation. The SAP then determines whether the driver has successfully complied with the recommendations and whether they're eligible to move forward in the return to duty process. If the SAP determines that the requirements have not been successfully completed, the driver may have additional steps to take before moving forward. And even after the SAP requirements are completed, the process still isn't finished. Before a driver can return to DOT safety-sensitive duties, there are additional requirements, including a return-to-duty drug or alcohol test, depending on the violation. And for many drivers, there will also be a required follow-up testing program that continues after they've returned to safety-sensitive work. So completing the SAP's recommendations is an important step, but it's only one part of the overall process. Next, let's walk through what happens when a driver reaches the return-to-duty stage. Once the driver has completed the requirements established by the substance abuse professional, and the SAP determines that the driver has successfully complied with those recommendations, the driver can move forward to the next stage of the return to duty process. But completing the SAP requirements does not automatically mean the driver can immediately get back behind the wheel. Before returning to DOT safety-sensitive duties, the driver must successfully complete the required return-to-duty testing process. The return-to-duty test must produce a negative result before the driver can legally resume safety-sensitive functions. It's also important to understand that the return-to-duty test isn't necessarily the end of the testing requirements. The SAP will establish a follow-up testing plan that may require additional unannounced testing after the driver returns to safety-sensitive work. That follow-up testing program is separate from the regular random testing program that applies to CDL drivers. The specific requirements of the follow-up plan are determined as part of the SAP process and must be followed. There's another important distinction drivers need to understand. Completing the return-to-duty process means you've satisfied the requirements necessary to become eligible again to perform DOT safety-sensitive work. It does not mean that an employer is required to return you to your previous driving position, and it does not guarantee that another trucking company will hire you. Becoming eligible to drive again under DOT requirements and actually finding a carrier willing to employ you are two different things. And that's exactly what we're going to talk about next. The employment reality after completing the SAP and return to duty process. Now we come to one of the most important parts of this entire briefing, the employment reality after completing the SAP and return to duty process. Successfully completing the required process may restore your eligibility to perform DOT safety-sensitive duties, but eligibility and employment are two very different things. Completing the process does not guarantee that your previous employer will return you to a driving position. It also does not require another trucking company to hire you. Every carrier establishes its own hiring standards and employment policies within applicable laws and regulations. Some carriers may consider drivers who have completed the return-to-duty process, while others may have different requirements or may choose not to consider applicants with certain histories. Insurance requirements can also play a role. A carrier may have hiring standards influenced by its insurance provider, its customers, the type of freight it hauls, or its own internal safety and risk management policies. That's why two drivers with similar situations may receive very different answers from two different trucking companies. Drivers should also be careful about assuming that completing the SAP process automatically clears their employment history or removes all records associated with the violation. The return to duty process is designed to address eligibility under DOT requirements. It is not a guarantee of employment, and it does not mean that every carrier will evaluate your situation the same way. If you're going through this process, ask questions, understand the requirements, verify information with qualified professionals, and when speaking with potential employers, be honest about your situation and make sure you understand their individual hiring policies. The most important takeaway is simple. Becoming eligible to return to DOT safety-sensitive work opens the door to legally performing those duties again. But it doesn't guarantee that a particular employer will invite you through that door. And that brings us to the final part of this briefing. Why protecting your CDL and the career you've built around it should always be taken seriously. Finally, let's talk about protecting your CDL and the career you've worked to build. For many professional drivers, a CDL is much more than a license in your wallet. It's your livelihood. It's how the mortgage gets paid, how groceries get put on the table, and how you provide for yourself and your family. That's why the decisions you make away from the driver's seat can sometimes be just as important as the decisions you make behind the wheel. One of the biggest areas of confusion involves the difference between state laws and federal DOT regulations. Something being legal under the laws of your state does not necessarily mean it's permitted for a CDL driver working in a DOT-regulated safety-sensitive position. Marijuana is probably the most common example. Regardless of changing state laws, CDL drivers subject to federal DOT drug testing regulations must understand the federal requirements that apply to them. Don't rely on something you heard from another driver at a truck stop. Don't assume something is okay because somebody posted it on social media. And don't wait until you're facing a violation to learn how the rules apply to your career. Take the time to understand the regulations. Ask questions. Verify the information with qualified sources and professionals when necessary, because one decision can create consequences that last much longer than the decision itself. A CDL can provide a driver with a good career and the opportunity to earn a living for decades. Protecting that career means understanding the responsibilities that come with it. Nobody plans on finding themselves in the SAP or return to duty process. But the best time to understand the consequences is before you're ever faced with them. Your CDL may be a piece of plastic in your wallet, but the career attached to it can represent years of experience, hundreds of thousands of miles, and the financial security of an entire family. Protect it accordingly. That brings us to the end of this Sarge's briefing. If there's one thing I hope you take away from this video, it's that a DOT drug or alcohol violation can have consequences that extend far beyond a single test. The SAP and return to duty process provides a path for eligible drivers to work toward returning to DOT safety-sensitive duties. But completing that process doesn't erase the violation, and it doesn't guarantee employment with a trucking company. Every driver's circumstances are different. Regulations can change, carrier policies vary, and employment decisions can depend on a number of factors. That's why it's important to understand the rules that apply to you, verify the information you're receiving, and speak with qualified professionals when you're dealing with your own specific situation. This video wasn't made to judge anyone who's found themselves going through this process. It was made to help drivers better understand what can happen and why the decisions you make today can have a lasting impact on your career tomorrow. If you found this briefing helpful, take a moment to like the video, subscribe to Truck Stop Talk with Sarge, and leave a comment below. Let me know what other trucking industry topics you'd like to see covered in a future Sarge's briefing. And remember, the information provided in this video is for general informational purposes only and should not be considered legal or professional advice. Always consult the appropriate qualified professional regarding your individual circumstances. Thanks for spending a little time with me today. Until next time, drive safe, make good decisions, and I'll see you at the next truck stop.